So recording has started, and welcome everyone. I'm Marion Pallister. I'm the chair of Pax Christi Scotland. I'd like to welcome our speakers, and I'd like to welcome all of you wherever you are in the world, and whatever time of day it might be as well. For me in Scotland, it's the middle of the day, and it's a very cold day. So I hope that all is well with you. We're going to start this proceedings with a reflection and prayer from Father John Convery, Pax Christi Scotland's chaplain. So if without any further ado, if I could hand over to you, Father John.
Thank you, Marion, and a warm welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, where everybody is, to this sunny Scotland. And I'd just like to begin our conversation and our dialogue today by just a small quote from Antonio Guterres on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women from 2017. Every woman and every girl has the right to a life free of violence. Yet this rupture of human rights occurs in a variety of ways in every community, particularly affecting those who are most marginalized and vulnerable. Around the world, more than 1 in 3 women have experienced physical, sexual violence in their lives. 750 million women were married before age 18, and more than 250 million have undergone female genital mutilation. It is now widely recognized that violence against women, including harassment and harmful practices, are major barriers to the fulfillment of human rights, and a direct challenge to women's inclusion and participation in sustaining peace. Without tackling it, we will never fulfill the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is time to further our collective action to end violence against women and girls for good. That takes all of us working together in our own countries, regions, and communities, at the same time towards the same goal. It is time for united action from all of us, so that women and girls around the world can live free from harassment, harmful practices, and all other forms of violence. And we pray this morning to the God of our own understanding. God of mercy, we remember before you our own communities, the places where we live and work, the people whose lives are connected to ours. We bring before you all the people whose stories we are about to witness, and all those whose stories have shaped our lives. Show us how to confront violence and how to transform it into peace and justice. Fill us with your peace, that we may be peacemakers. Fill us with your truth, that we may speak truth to power. Fill us with your courage, that we may bring hope to those who live in fear. Fill us with joy, that we may become your beacons in this torn and unjust world. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Father John, for that, which brings us into our event very thoughtfully, because we come to this event from two perspectives today. Pax Christi Scotland is a member organisation of Pax Christi International, and we seek to promote a non-violent world. Today is, as John said, UN's International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And around the world during the pandemic, the statistics for gender violence have risen alarmingly, in some countries by as much as 25%. And we're aware that in Sri Lanka, gender violence is a major problem. Our second perspective is strongly linked to this issue. Pax Christi Scotland has campaigned for some time to halt Police Scotland's, that's the main police force in Scotland, training of Sri Lankan security officers based on evidence that after 15 years, human rights abuses by Sri Lankan officers continue. The pandemic has caused the training to cease, but yesterday, police authority in Scotland met, and the Chief Constable, Ian Livingston, announced that Police Scotland would not be making any more deployments to Sri Lanka before the end of the current contract in March 22. And there's an ongoing review which also affects that. But more importantly, that they have written to the British High Commission in Colombo to say that they will not be seeking to re-engage with Sri Lankan police after the end of the contract. Huge credit is due to the organizations that we have campaigned with: Freedom from Torture, the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice, and Human Rights Watch, members of the Scottish Parliament, such as Mercedes Villalba and former MSP Neil Findlay, and journalists like Marion Scott of the Sunday Post. But violence is not over for Sri Lanka. We're aware of that, and we now seek intervention from the UN, from world governments, including the UK's. And we're pleased with this very positive turn of events, but we see it as a beginning, not an end. And so we would hope that our speakers today will help us to raise awareness. And I would first like to introduce journalist, author, and director of the International Truth and Justice Project, Frances Harrison. For 2 decades, Frances was the BBC foreign correspondent for Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Iran, reporting for TV, radio, and online. She gained an in-depth insight and expertise in the region and spent 4 years living in Sri Lanka while at the BBC. Now, she has also worked with Amnesty International, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and other UN commissions. And her book, which I would highly recommend, Still Counting the Dead, Survivors of Sri Lanka's Hidden War, documents personal stories from the final phase of the war in Sri Lanka. The International Truth and Justice Project is an independent international non-profit organization working since 2013 to protect and promote justice and accountability in Sri Lanka. Headquartered in South Africa, it comprises award-winning human rights lawyers, journalists, researchers, and trauma experts who collectively document war crimes and ongoing human rights violations. Pursuing justice and accountability on behalf of victims, its mission is to pursue justice and accountability on behalf of victims' testimony, and supporting documents are preserved for future litigation, sanctions, vetting and screening, and UN submissions. So, Frances, may I hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion, and thank you for inviting us. And obviously, it is a very small victory in the face of the things that need to be done. But the decision that came from Scotland yesterday about the police training was something that we have to note and be happy about. For us, for the ITJP, it was 5 years ago that we were the first organisation to call for a review of the training. After, actually, I went to Geneva in 2016 and heard the Attorney General of Sri Lanka at that point boasting that the British police or the Scottish police had been training the anti-terror police in Sri Lanka. And we were quite shocked because we were picking up a lot of cases at the time of them being involved in torture. And so this has been something that we've been working on for a very, very long time. And to be clear, it should have happened a long time ago. It's torture doesn't stop and start depending on who's in power, unless the government does something to try and stop it. And we all know that torture has been systematic and widespread. Sorry, I'm having my screen's gone. Systematic and widespread and part of structural impunity in Sri Lanka. So training the perpetrators of torture does make us all complicit in that kind of abuse. So it's a great step forward. It should have happened earlier, and there are still many other steps ahead of us that we need to take. But I think I'd like really today to talk obviously about women who have experienced this kind of violence in Sri Lanka. And I'd like to start by telling you the story of a woman. I'm going to call her Rajani, but it's not her real name for obvious security reasons. And I want to just show to you really what this sort of abuse does to the victims. And then I'll also talk later about how victims try and come back from that and how we try and help them survive this process. So it was about a month after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power in 2019 that 4 plainclothes officers came to Rajani's house at night. Her mother tried to stop them abducting her, but she was beaten. They said they were from the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department of the Sri Lankan police, the same police units that Scotland's been training for many years with our taxpayers' money. Those 10 days of illegal detention changed Rajani's life forever. She was fingerprinted, stripped naked, punched, kicked and slapped, dragged by her hair, whipped with cables, burned with cigarettes, rendered unconscious by having a plastic bag soaked in petrol put over her head, forced to sign a false confession in a language she didn't understand, asked to work as an informer, and repeatedly raped. Rajani is still haunted by her experiences. She now only sleeps a few hours a night. The family she stays with in the north of England regularly hear her shout out at night, "Leave me alone, don't touch me." They have to lock her in the bedroom to prevent her going to the kitchen, taking a knife and trying to kill herself. She attempted suicide 3 times in Sri Lanka before she got here. She can't cope with sudden noises or crowds, and she still avoids men, all men. There are times when she clutches her head in her hands and pulls on her hair. When she first arrived in the UK, and I think this is some of the most telling detail really, she couldn't even hold a teacup because her hands shook so much. She would cry and repeat, "I want to die, I want to die." An independent medical examiner found 59 cigarette burns on Rajani's body, 2 on her breast, 7 on the top of both thighs, and 23 on the back of her thighs. The burns on the top part of the thighs are indicative of force used to open a woman's legs before rape. Like so many victims arriving abroad, an expert declared Rajani too traumatized even to be able to testify in her own asylum case. She's been brutalized to the point of being completely muted, immobilized for her own protection, and robbed of her agency even to say what happened to her. The UK government has spent millions of pounds of our tax money on training the Sri Lankan police since 2010, ironically, in gender sensitivity, among other things. In 2015, a UN investigation named several Sri Lankan police units as perpetrating torture and using sexual violence as part of a policy. 6 years later, Sri Lanka's anti-terror police are still involved in the torture and rape of men and women. Did we really think Sri Lankan law enforcement officers needed Britain to teach them that rape is wrong and a crime? Surely society teaches them that. And it's worth remembering torture by Sri Lankan security forces has been endemic since 1971. And today's notorious white van abductions by plainclothes state agents were first perpetrated against Sinhalese in the late 80s. And then, of course, the victims were generally from the same community as the perpetrators. But how easily those same tactics were repurposed against a different ethnic community. dehumanizing the victims with ethnic slurs, calling them Tamil dogs, terrorists, or delivering sexually explicit insults in their own language to make sure the debilitating abuse is fully internalized. It is important to acknowledge the ethnic dimension to the abuse that Tamils have experienced at the hands of the Sri Lankan police and army. We've documented cases where the Sinhala victims are given a chair to sit on during interrogations, while the Tamils are always forced to kneel, handcuffed. Sinhala victims of torture have the option to file complaints, risky as that is, but Tamils rarely do. Not to mention that the thousands of Tamil victims abroad never stop to think of reporting the crime before fleeing, so they're not captured in any detail, or the unknown number of Muslim detention cases now that are even more difficult to document. It's also worth noting that promoting women into police stations isn't magically going to change the culture. In cases we've documented, numerous Sinhalese women are involved in the torture, and sometimes even prepared female victims for their male colleagues to rape, or just mop up the blood afterwards. No amount of training or capacity building will change this culture and the level of racism and dehumanization, or make a dent in decades of systematic violations and structural impunity. A police officer named by the UN in 2007 as someone who should have been charged for his alleged role in torture is now a senior DIG, Deputy Inspector General of Police, in charge of administration, which means he oversees discipline and conduct. There are so many examples of alleged perpetrators rising to the top of the system, some of them trained by the UK too. Piecemeal reforms and foreign training will never change a rotten system. So where does this impunity leave the victims, especially those outside the country who are largely invisible? Training of the very police units who attempted to destroy them as human beings constitutes denial and another form of violence against the truth. I manage a survivors group that brings survivors of torture together and where they take charge of putting themselves back to the people they once were. The women in the group have formed a powerful mutual support system of solidarity, but they express themselves through their artistic creations, not in meetings like this. During COVID, they learned embroidery, teaching themselves the stitches from YouTube videos in Tamil. One canvas depicted a girl in a sari with her back to the viewer on a swing with a long plaited hair, surrounded by jasmine flowers and giant colorful birds. It was an expression of the people they'd been before in times past. Their landscapes are always populated by birds, never fellow human beings, and it's pretty obvious why. These women also write poetry in Tamil, and it appears to me to be this medium that allows them to find language to describe the journey back to life from the torture chamber. To close, I'm going to read a part of one of the poems, obviously in translation. It's called My Courage, and it's written by an absolutely extraordinary survivor who's an ex-combatant. Like all the women, she struggles with how to withstand the expectations of her family and the community here, and how to forge her own path, contending along the way, of course, with a great deal of unspoken and spoken stigma. Her poem describes how in her new world of exile, she eventually started to recapture her identity after many, many years. So I'll read a portion. Wherever I searched, the lost paradise I couldn't see again. But will I give up? Hastily, I gathered myself, boarded my memory vehicle, and I flew away in the sky of my heart. As I got used to the route, my journey continued. Thick forests, roaring rivers, playful deer, swinging monkeys, fragrant flowers gently stroking the breeze. Experiencing this, I ventured inside. There, in an unadulterated world devoid of human stain, at a quiet, serene hut, unperturbed by the solitude, stood smiling, a lion of a girl. Edging nearer, I looked closely. I saw myself. The rediscovery of oneself and the resilience in the face of unspeakable ordeals does take extraordinary courage. And I have to say, the news from Scotland has been a boost. Survivors said it made them feel that Scotland was concerned about them. And obviously they hope that other countries like Australia will follow suit. And one torture survivor actually texted me from Canada saying, wow, it's like I got a multivitamin dose. It's just around the street. But having said that, today I was with the survivors, and because it's the time when Tamils remember the dead from the war, they held a very private ceremony, about 30 or 40 people with flowers and candles, remembering the people in their families who they lost in the war. And I have to say, in the midst of this extraordinarily heavy grief and sense of loss, 12 years later, where they know that they can't, that people in Sri Lanka are not free to mourn in the same way. It's very hard to see even a small step forward like the Scottish training being cancelled as a beacon of hope for them, because there is so much grief and it hangs heavy on them. So on that note, I think just remembering the context. Thank you.
Gosh, yeah, well, thank you, Francis, for shocking insights, for that small beacon of light that perhaps people are able to see, and perhaps now to move on. But let's use this occasion to raise as much awareness of the need to move on and the need to seek action by the UN, Australia, UK, wherever, how necessary that is. May I now introduce Father Nandana Manatunga, who will speak about gender violence in the context of his work as Director of the Human Rights Office in Kandy, the ancient capital of Sri Lanka. As well as being Director of the Human Rights Office, Father Nandana is a member of the Pax Christi Facilitation Team of Asia Pacific. He has long experience in working with victims of torture and rape, prisoners and families of the disappeared. In 2018, he was awarded the Korean Gwanglu Prize for his work on human rights and the award for outstanding individuals aspiring to the restoration of justice and human rights in Asian countries. Father Nandana is certainly such an individual, and may I hand over to you now, Father Nandana.
Thank you very much, Marian, and for us, good evening. Well, I would like to move on with the introduction to the situation, the present situation. I would like to give you the present situation in the context of the whole the human rights situation in the country. So that might help you to understand what kind of a human rights situation in place right now in Sri Lanka. And in that context, what type of torture that is happening, and also gender-based violence and the violence against women. So I would like to use some slides and explain.
Can I just make you, oops. Can I make you co-host and then you can share your screen?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's about torture and gender-based violence in Sri Lanka. Now, actually, apart from police brutality and torture, which is already happening in Sri Lanka, we are actually in a kind of a militarized state in Sri Lanka with COVID-19 situation, because all the powers are given to military. All the exercises with regard to COVID-19 are given to military. So military and the police have lots of powers in Sri Lanka, and even the chief of the anti-COVID-19 task force is the chief of the military. So we are in a kind of a very militarized situation, and they have lots of powers, the military as well as the police. So there is even, I mean, all the health regulations and all the COVID-19 regulations are actually being monitored and being carried out by the military, which has made life very difficult for the people in Sri Lanka. And during the last 2 years, actually, the number of extrajudicial killings are very much on the increase. So many people who were arrested were killed while they were in detention. And very little kind of investigations into this type of killings. Certainly, still disappearances are taking place in the country. And many of the journalists and still during the last 2 years after the appointment, election of the new government and also the president, journalists are being continually harassed. And if they speak anything about the government, anything about the military, anything about the police, they will have to pay that. And but also I would like to say something with regard to prisons, because we are working in the prisons, in 2 of the major prisons. Prisons are not safe at all. If they riot, they will be shot. I mean, there were several incidents in the recent past where prisoners were just shot, and later they said even the bodies were not given to the families because they said they are detected as COVID patients. And in the country now, there are a lot of agitation, campaign and protest by farmers because lack of fertilizer. And fisherfolk is also suffering a lot because 2 ships actually were burnt in our shores, and all the seashore was destroyed. And the tea plantations also are suffering because of manure and fertilizer. And continuous protests by the teachers are going on, and several times they launch strikes. And also right now the medical staff and also the free trade workers are actually on the protest against the present regime and the present government. So this is a background, a wide context in Sri Lanka. Torture has become the most common investigation during the interrogations in Sri Lanka, but this is although it is the usual investigation method. Whether it is in the north, whether it is or in the south, it is the same. But I would like to now say something add to this, because this COVID-19 situation has given a lot of powers to the police, and there are so many cases reported during the last few months of since 2020, because all the health restrictions are actually now being implemented and monitored by the police. So they, at their own will, they will arrest people. I mean, for even little things like, say, not wearing a mask, they will arrest people. Sometimes they even torture people who are not wearing, for the reason that they are not wearing a mask. Sometimes they are being even produced in court after torture, and they are handcuffed, and sometimes even they are in prison. So I mean, little health guidelines being not been adhered to, they go on because they have all the powers. So they know their friends, they know their enemies, they know who are working against police, like especially the torture victims who are taking action against the perpetrators. They are being monitored, and they are being followed, and they are being punished. Due to the, I mean, there is a serious problem with our judicial system now, because most of the appointments of judges, because now with the new 20th amendment to the constitution, we don't have any independent commissions. So even the judiciary, the judges are appointed by the president. So rule of law is really at stake, because the way the judges behave, the way the judges give judgments, the way those who had cases, I mean, those who are now in the parliament, those who are being alleged of corruption, how they are being free. I mean, even those who are being in the prison for murder charges, how the president has pardoned them. So the rule of law is at stake, and the perpetrators go unpunished, because president at his own will, he give presidential pardon to even those who are given death sentences. As I mentioned before, militarization with COVID-19 pandemic, law enforcement agencies enjoy impunity, but they have all the powers to harass people. And this is mostly, I mean, it's happening in the South, but is as it was mentioned, it is really in a very serious situation when it comes to the North, very especially to the Tamil speaking North, those who are in the North. Now we have laws against torture. We have this Act number 29 of 1994. But however, I mean, we as an organization, we had few cases before the before 2000, I think 10. I mean, for the last many years, the Attorney General's Department has not been able to prosecute torture perpetrators under this act. So therefore, because if they have been prosecuted and if they have been punished, because we have some cases where the police officers were punished, but it is not happening anymore. So therefore, they know that nothing is going to prevent or nothing is going to happen to them even if they are tortured. Now, for example, we have several cases where the police officers are being even given promotion. The OICs have been given promotions as HQIs and some are even promoted as SPs. So they know they can enjoy impunity. I mean, they have no allegations. Even those who had allegations, those who had cases, they have been just released. And torture victims, I mean, they have, as it was mentioned earlier, they have very devastating consequences, physical, mental, and social well-being. Added to that, they have been still being monitored even after they are released from the prison, even after they are being sent home. They are being monitored, questioned again and again. Very especially the victims from the North. We have actually, as an organization, we did a lot of cases of the victims in the North. We had several cases. Our lawyers appeared on behalf of PTA victims, those who are being called or labeled as terrorists. So even after they are released from court, after they are totally released, they are still being monitored. They are being questioned. They are being visited. So that type of kind of a harassment is going on. Torture, I mean, I could say torture. Now, this person, even he's in the hospital, a torture victim. His the torture because of torture, his leg was broken into 5. I mean, in 5 places. So he was in hospital, but he was chained to the bed. I mean, you can see the chain. So this type of torture not only destroys his body, but destroys the whole person. Many types of torture being used, and some can result permanent damages. And there are victims who are unable to walk, victims who cannot hear, victims who cannot see, who have lost completely the eyesight, and so on. Coming into gender-based violence, now I put this picture because she was clearly harassed by the police because of a land issue, because her land was wanted by a police officer, because she did not allow that. She was dragged and she was beaten several times, and she was imprisoned for 6 months. And the first case was that she didn't come in white dress to the court, which is in the law, there is nothing like that, that there is no dress code. But just because they wanted to punish her, they got the judge to punish her, and she was in prison for 2 weeks for not wearing a white dress. And because she fought against the police. She is a real, very courageous person. And because she fought against the police station, now the police has filed 42 cases against her, 42 cases. And even very recently, early this year, she was again arrested and she was in prison for 6 months. And her daughter was arrested, and the son-in-law was arrested, and the daughter-in-law was arrested. So 5 from the same family were arrested because she was fighting with the police, because we filed a fundamental right case against the police officers. So by threatening, they were asking her to withdraw the case. So altogether now, police has filed 42 cases against her. Now, according to studies, out of female population is 51.6 in Sri Lanka, and out of 51.6 female population, 20.4 women are subject to domestic violence. In the sense, they are being harassed and being brutally tortured at home, not only sometimes by the husband, sometimes by, well, the brother of the husband or the father-in-law. Also, it is this is very much happening, especially after the COVID-19 restrictions. As I said, violence against women is becoming a very, very serious issue in Sri Lanka. Especially, I mean, it is both in north and also in the south. You may have heard about this case of Ishalini, who was a girl, a young girl, a 16-year young girl, who was working in a house of a parliamentarian. Because of the poverty, because most of these plantation girls are sent to Colombo to work. And there were 11 girls working in that house before, in this parliamentarian's house. And out of 11, one jumped into the train and committed suicide, and another girl died at home. And this girl was, we cannot still prove it, but she was burnt and she died in the hospital. So this is her father and the mother speaking to the media. We are the first people who brought them to media. So this became a kind of a very hot topic in the society, because this is only one case, but from their own village, as I said, there were 11 girls taken to the same house, and all of them, they say that they were, all of them were subjected to abuse and rape. And as I said, torture is becoming very sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated in their methods. Now, police have found so many different methods to torture people without leaving any marks. Sometimes they bathe them with cold water before torture, before assault, so that there will be no marks. Because in our Sri Lankan system, it is very unfortunate. Without any medical evidence, we cannot proceed with a case. If there is no, I mean, mental torture is not regarded as torture. So if there are only physical marks or damage, only we can proceed with a case. So this is something very, I mean, unfortunate in Sri Lanka. Torture victims do not, I mean, most of the torture victims in Sri Lanka are not from very wealthy families. They are the most, I mean, mostly from the poor families. All those who come to us and all those who need support and all those who are actually tortured are from the very backward social background in the society, and therefore they do not want to break the silence. They didn't want to speak about their torture. They didn't want to specially come out and make a complaint. And until I think 2018, we were never able to get women victims to speak. In 2018, during the torture day, we were able to get few women. I mean, especially that woman I showed the photo, herself and many other torture victims for the first time coming out in public and speaking about their torture and against their perpetrators. Yes, so torture victims now in Sri Lanka, whether it is female or male torture victims, because of this COVID situation, they have to hide and live in like they have to find safe places, safe houses, and it is very difficult sometimes to protect them and also provide the security and protection, because two of our torture victims in the past were shot dead by the police. So we have to change their places to provide protection and security. Yes. So what we are doing, I think, is not very relevant. So I don't want to go further in this one, because I think I think I have taken all my time. Thank you very much, Marian. And if there's any question, I am ready.
Thank you, Father Nandana. That is one of the most shocking PowerPoints that I think Pax Christi Scotland members have had to watch. We thank you for that moving account of your work and of what is going on. I think that what Frances said before about the lady that she mentioned, and what you were talking about, the fact that torture destroys the body, but also the whole person. I think that that is something that we must remember and take forward as we ask higher authorities to take some kind of action that is going to stop this situation proceeding. I would now like to introduce human rights lawyer Dasha Jagathiswaran, the co-director of the, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong as well, Adiyalam Centre for Policy Research, a Jaffna-based human rights think tank that she helped to set up while living in Jaffna between 2016 and 2018, alongside a group of local academics and researchers. The organization is one of the few think tanks based directly in the northeast of Sri Lanka, and it's driven by a philosophy of being directly accountable to the war-affected communities whose voices it seeks to amplify. Dasha's work on Sri Lanka over the last decade has focused primarily on researching the impacts of militarization, documenting and advocating for accountability for atrocity crimes, and building the capacity of victim survivor groups. She's worked closely with protesting Tamil families of the disappeared in the north and east of Sri Lanka, a largely women-run movement of family members of victims of enforced disappearances. Dasha is a Tamil Canadian human rights lawyer called to the Bar of Ontario and currently based in the UK. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from McMaster University, is a Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto, and a Master in Law from the London School of Economics. Dasha, please tell us more about your work now.
Thank you, Marian, for that intro and having me as a speaker today. Just to start by saying, I'm here speaking in my capacity as the co-director of Adiyalam Centre for Policy Research, which you actually did pronounce fine, and not with any of the other hats that I wear. Thank you, Francis and Father Nandana, for speaking in detail about the horrific and systemic issues of torture and abuse that continue to prevail in Sri Lanka, as well as their gendered impacts. In my presentation, I thought I would talk about gendered violence and how it intersects with issues of militarization, surveillance, and protest, particularly in how it impacts Tamil communities in the north and east of Sri Lanka, which is sort of the area of my expertise. So since Adialam began operating in 2016, we have looked extensively at issues of militarization across the Northeast. Just for background and context, it is one of the most heavily militarized areas in the world. A study we did in 2017 found that in the district of Mullaitivu, which is part of the war-affected Vanni region in the north, there is a ratio of 1 soldier to every 2 civilians in the district, which is pretty significant. But the insidious nature of that militarization goes beyond just the physical presence of soldiers in camps. It has also become part of what are traditionally civilian areas of life, such as agriculture, business, and tourism, and has also had a dire impact on intra-community relationships as well. As Father Nandana has already described, the levels of militarization have only grown worse since Gotabaya Rajapaksa has become president. In many ways, they've now taken over further functions of civilian governance. So for example, in response to COVID-19, Rajapaksa appointed one of 2 kind of directing centers, a presidential task force led by his brother, and then several members of the security sector, including Shivendra Silva, who's the head of the army and has been actually given a travel ban by the US State Department because of his the credible evidence against him in respect of the end of the war. Several of the security force members who were part of this task force were really only there because they had already been assigned or appointed head of these notionally civilian authorities. So that included, for instance, the head of the task force for poverty eradication and livelihood development, which in real terms should have nothing to do with the military. And a lot of this has actually been documented by ITJP, and there's a really helpful kind of map of the individuals who overlap with the security forces who are on these task forces on their website, which I would urge people to look at. The government has also brought several civilian authorities under the Ministry of Defense. So that ranges from the NGO Secretariat to the Disaster Management Center. And the heavy militarization of the Northeast and civilian authorities only further marginalizes and increases the vulnerability of Tamil women living in those areas, particularly former LTT cadres, which I will refer to in my presentation as ex-combatants, and those who are in charge of kind of singularly headed, women-headed households. As has already been described, members of the military are perpetrators in many instances of sexual violence against women, but also disturbingly in these areas, de facto decision makers. So for example, in many rural communities in the Vanni, they won't know who their local DS or GA is, which are local government positions, but they will know the name of the local military commander. And that means that there's very little recourse for women who have been victims of sexual violence by either the military or even civilians. In the post-war context, the military and police have taken charge of these areas and are responsible for security and to some extent governance. Women have told us that the police rarely take seriously their complaints of sexual violence or harassment. Many feel they have no one to whom to report the crimes perpetrated by the security forces. And in the rare instances where complaints are filed against military personnel, Tamil women report feeling scared of reprisals and facing reprisals. These issues are magnified for women ex-combatants. So ex-combatants remain one of the most vulnerable communities in Sri Lanka, securitized by the state and socially isolated and stigmatized by their own communities. For women ex-combatants, there are additional gendered aspects to the precarious security situation they face. The securitization of ex-combatants, which I'm using as defined as sort of rendering them to be seen as ongoing threats to the state, has been a powerfully destructive tool used by the security forces. It means they are subjected to repeated and unexpected visits by the intelligence forces. And just again, as a kind of an explainer, the intelligence forces in Sri Lanka are sort of collectively referred to colloquially as the CID. That doesn't necessarily mean that these people are actually from the CID, which is the Criminal Investigation Department, but it's just the term used by most people to describe the kind of shadowy intelligence figures that come to visit them at home or call them and harass them. They're also subjected to phone calls. Their wider families and often places of employment face harassment. And recently, in kind of recent years, they've also increasingly been subjected to false arrests and accusations. So for women ex-combatants, these security risks are further heightened. So when CID officers are coming to interrogate them, particularly women who don't necessarily have a man present in the household, They tend to come more frequently, and in some instances, and I think as Frances has described in the case she mentioned, have been sexually assaulted or tortured. There are several instances in which they are often have photos taken of them without their consent. They are subjected to lewd comments and kind of derogatory remarks. And then even where they kind of work up the courage to report this to the police, they're often further harassed, with women kind of describing police officers behaving inappropriately towards them and doing the exact same type of behavior that they are coming to report. Many of these women are already survivors of horrific instances of torture and sexual violence that they were subjected to during the so-called rehabilitation process post-war. And I use quotations because it was anything but rehabilitation. One of the findings we've made that corroborates what ITJP and others have found with survivors who've managed to flee the country is that during this so-called rehabilitation process, there was endemic torture and sexual violence, and there was no real intention of any kind of traditional notion of rehabilitation. So the communities that these women live in see and observe this securitization. And so to avoid themselves becoming securitized, they tend to stigmatize ex-combatants and give them a wide berth. And for women ex-combatants, this is even worse than sort of male ex-combatants having returned to fundamentally patriarchal societies. So women ex-combatants, for example, really struggle to find willing marriage partners where they do want to get married. Even where women ex-combatants have been able to marry, they face high levels of domestic violence. As Father Nandana has explained, domestic violence is an issue that affects all communities in Sri Lanka, but has to be understood when it comes to ex-combatants through that particular lens. So while both men and women ex-combatants report domestic violence, it's women ex-combatants alone who have reported physical violence to us. And many women ex-combatants report that domestic violence comes out of their status as an ex-combatant, and particularly this perception that while they were part of the LTT, they may have slept or had relations with other men in the LTT and then were likely abused by the military during the so-called rehabilitation process. And really, unfortunately, the communities they live in view this as kind of an example of how they became corrupted. And this obviously then creates huge problems and harm to them when they return to these communities and the domestic violence they face. There are women ex-combatants though who have come back to their communities and defied the security forces and against all odds taken up community leadership positions, though they are few in number. And for those women, they also report domestic violence at home that relates to their status as ex-combatants, where people from the community will kind of complain to their husbands saying, this woman is too authoritative or opinionated. But in all of these instances, they have nowhere to turn. As I've already described, the police and security forces themselves are perpetrators of violence against these women ex-combatants. And because of their securitized status, they are even less able to go through traditional mechanisms to report these instances of violence. And yet, despite this heavy militarization and securitization, I think it's really important to note that it is Tamil women in the North and East who are at the forefront of protests challenging the state on multiple grounds. Tamil families of the disappeared, which are almost entirely women-led, and these are families of victims of enforced disappearances, and primarily at the hands of the state, actually, have been protesting roadside now since February 2017, demanding truth and accountability about their loved ones. Tamil women have also played a key role in protests to take land back that the military illegally acquired. So in April 2018, for example, I joined villagers from Iranathivu, which is a tiny village off the coast of Mannar, which is on the western coast of the northern province, who decided that they were tired of political speeches and empty promises, had spent almost a decade displaced, and decided to launch a flotilla of boats with white flags to take back their island in an act of civil disobedience. That charge was primarily led by women from the village who wanted to be able to return to their livelihoods, which were very much centered around that island. And in their own words, were tired of having to rely on male breadwinners to survive. And I'll never forget the image of women landing on the dock of Iranathivu, having stared down a military boat that was initially docked there. They were ultimately successful in getting their land back, but in classic kind of Sri Lanka fashion, the government has tried to put up obstacle after obstacle in terms of them being able to properly develop and resettle. And And that kind of leads me to sort of the last point I want to make, which is that these women who have put themselves out there very courageously to lead these protests are themselves subjected to significant harassment, intimidation, and violence, which we've been documenting since 2017, but has stemmed from way beyond before that point. And this has really ramped up under Gotabaya's presidency and during the pandemic. Under the guise of the pandemic, police began obtaining court orders to stop protests from occurring sorry, I just had something in my throat. Under regulations that can't be appropriately used to restrict freedom of expression. And during the latter half of 2020, families of the disappeared decided to defy those court orders and engage again in protests that were acts of civil disobedience, but they were pushed and harassed and had their documentation taken from them. And then women organizers were threatened with inquiry if they chose to continue. But the security forces didn't just stop there. They've really ramped up harassment and intimidation of the individual women leaders of these communities. For example, a Tamil woman land protest organizer in the north, who herself was displaced, has had 7 different cases filed against her by police. Towards the end of 2019, she and her daughter met with a suspicious road accident and suffered minor injuries. When she filed a case with the police, they just sort of ignored it until the Human Rights Commission intervened. And according to her, she felt like this was a psychological attack to stop her from organizing. And she felt like they have succeeded somewhat because she is just, in her own words, tired of it all. The same kind of pattern of behavior happens to Tamil women organizers of the families of the disappeared. So for example, in one instance, a Tamil woman organizer was called repeatedly by intelligence, who went from trying to be friendly to eventually threatening her. They parked their vehicle outside her house, announced on a loudspeaker in her village that she would be arrested if the protest happened, and police then tried to arrest another person she had been speaking to. Her family is now afraid to come to her house, and she lives in constant fear of arrest. So under the Rajapaksas, even these incredibly brave women have been slowly and systematically silenced by repressive security forces. And I know I've probably gone over time, but I just want to conclude by saying that when the UK and other states provide security assistance to Sri Lanka, even when it's couched in terms like community policing, the examples that I and others have highlighted in respect of gender-based violence and other abuses is what they are risking direct or indirect complicity in, and at a very minimum are condoning. Sri Lanka fundamentally is still a state with an ongoing conflict, very much fueled and perpetrated by a state which centers its policies on Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and renders all other communities on the island either expendable or securitized. In recent years, this has moved beyond just the Tamil community to also severely impact the Muslim community as well. And the themes that have cut across all of our presentations of impunity for police and security forces, a regime headed by credibly accused war criminals, and significant militarization will not be remedied via international assistance or cooperation, and instead must be outright condemned. Human rights defenders, journalists, civil society, and lawyers in Sri Lanka are being silenced at every turn. Even we at Adayalam, because I am the only one who's outside of the country, whereas the rest of my colleagues are there, have had to stop most of our public-facing work. And so it is really up to the international community and actors to send a strong message to the Sri Lankan government that this kind of action will not be tolerated or condoned. Thank you.
Thank you, Darsha. And I think that will say to us all that all those of us who have been campaigning to stop the work of Police Scotland feel now very justified. If we had any doubts before that, your insights are so valuable to us. I'd now like to, before I do, could I just remind you that we will have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. So if you have those, please put them in the chat. But meanwhile, can I introduce Melissa Dring, Campaign Director of the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice since 2019, who is going to explain how we in Scotland can support her organisation and her involvement in our campaign to move things on now that Police Scotland's training seems to have, we are assured, to have stopped. The Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice is a global non-partisan movement that aims to achieve genuine reconciliation based on accountability for violations of international law, build respect for human rights and the rule of law, and support efforts within Sri Lankan civil society to promote a just and lasting peace, which we are hearing is taking a very long time to achieve. Melissa holds an MSc in Violence, Conflict and Development from the School of Oriental Studies, University of London, and previously worked on UK consumer protection and fraud prevention. Melissa, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion, for that introduction, and thanks for all of you for being here to hear us speak today about this. I want to start just by thanking the previous presenters, Francis, Father Nandana, and Darsha, for your powerful words about the ongoing violations and horrific crimes that are happening in Sri Lanka. Initially, my presentation, I was going to talk to you about the campaign to halt the training that Police Scotland were delivering in Sri Lanka. And I've had to hastily kind of reconfigure that presentation. So forgive me if it's a little less polished than it perhaps could be. But I want to spend a little time, first of all, just talking about the effort that it's taken us to get to this point, actually, where Police Scotland have made this decision to stop the training, because I think that's important and a good lesson for us to think about when we think about future campaigning. And then I'll go on to speak a little bit about why we need to keep on campaigning and what you can do to help us with that. So first of all, fantastic news yesterday, the Chief Constable announcing that Police Scotland will no longer be training Sri Lankan police. As you've already heard from Francis and from others, this is the result of a very long, years-long campaign, first started by ITJP, and a lot of different organisations and people have been involved in this campaign along the way. Where we started, I guess, back 5 or 6 years ago, the early efforts of the campaigning were to find out exactly what was happening in terms of police training. There is very limited transparency on these kind of security assistance programs, certainly in the UK, but also in other countries internationally. It is quite challenging to find out exactly what is being done and who is being trained. So a lot of the early efforts went into some of that. And as Francis has mentioned, investigative journalism and that campaigning found out some quite shocking revelations about who exactly was being trained by Police Scotland. Members of some of the divisions that you've heard about already today, the CID, the TID and the Special Task Force, all of which are accused of serious violations of human rights, including gender-based violence and systematic torture. From there, I guess, to bring it more up to date, I guess the pressure on Police Scotland has been building since the election of Gotabaya Rajapaksa in November 2019. That government pulled out of international agreements on to progress accountability for human rights violations, has made and continues to make efforts to thwart accountability within Sri Lanka for human rights violations, and has increasingly become a militarized, authoritarian government. And the human rights situation, as you've heard from Father Nandana, it continues to worsen within Sri Lanka. So amongst this, earlier this year, in fact, there was a spate of reporting on deaths in custody. There were 6 deaths in custody reported between March and June 2021 alone. And repeated reports of torture. And in fact, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has twice this year made statements about her concerns about the prevalence of torture and extrajudicial killings by the security forces in Sri Lanka. At this point, I guess, my organisation, the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice, and a number of others have been engaging with politicians in the UK and with Police Scotland on this. As Marion said, Pax Christi Scotland, Human Rights Watch, Freedom from Torture, ITJP, the Tamil diaspora community within the UK and the Sunday Post, and investigative journalist Phil Miller have all been working very hard on this for a number of months, if not years. And this campaigning kind of came to a head, I guess, around the COP26, when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa visited Glasgow. There were significant protests by the Tamil community in Scotland, and also a number of media stories that really helped to bring this to attention. So I think it would be fair to say that Police Scotland have been feeling the pressure over recent months. So in some ways, the announcement yesterday was not a surprise, although we had no warning of it coming. So at this point, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who has been involved, who sent letters, who's spoken about the campaign, and who's shared it on social media, and anything else that people have done to contribute to the campaign. It really has only happened because of the vast number of people that were involved, and all the different efforts to secure the success. So thank you very much. It is a great achievement, but as the other speakers have said, it's not over yet. And this is, compared to the magnitude of the situation in Sri Lanka and the violations that are happening, this is relatively quite a small achievement, a drop in the ocean, as it were. So what happens next? I mean, as you've heard, victims of sexual violence and other crimes in Sri Lanka continue to be denied justice. There is systematic impunity for crimes committed by state actors, and the situation is deteriorating. The independent institutions that are supposed to be there for victims to be able to make complaints to bring their grievances to, their independence has been eroded. That includes the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, which is supposed to act as a watchdog on the government, as well as the judiciary. Senior members of the judiciary are under increasing pressure. There's also systematic racism against Tamils and Muslims in particular, that means they are more vulnerable to these kind of violations. So it's very important that we continue to campaign, and that we continue to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government from the outside as much as we can. There is a UN process in existence, working towards efforts for accountability in Sri Lanka. That comes from the Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, in some ways, this process at the Human Rights Council has been used by some states as a cover for them to continue normal bilateral engagement with Sri Lanka. So I think it would be fair to say that is the case in the UK. When we as campaigners have written to the UK government or to others to say, you need to stop training Police Scotland, you need Police Scotland to stop training the Sri Lankan police, or you need to halt military engagement in general, the response we get is, we are working with the Human Rights Council. We are working through the UN to improve the situation in Sri Lanka. And frankly, it's simply not good enough. The High Commissioner for Human Rights herself has encouraged countries to actually change their bilateral relations, to take what action they can independently, to also signal to Sri Lanka that the human rights situation and the ongoing impunity is not acceptable. So what is it that we're asking states to do? I mean, first of all, military engagement is a very obvious place to start. Within the UK, it's important that we work now to make sure that the UK government doesn't simply offer the contract for training Sri Lankan police to a different police force. At the moment, it's just Police Scotland who've said that they won't do this. So it's important that another police force doesn't take it up, that we make sure that the UK does no longer funds training for Sri Lankan police. But there's also other military engagement that the UK is involved in. So the UK has a resident defence advisor in Colombo. That defence advisor has met with senior military commanders who are accused of gross human rights violations on multiple occasions. The UK should withdraw that defence advisor. The defence advisor also organises training for Sri Lankan military. Again, it's very difficult to find information on this, but that training and that engagement needs to stop. And the same is true for other states. As we've heard, Australia has a defence relationship with Sri Lanka, as does the US and several other places. So a basic demand, first of all, is for states to stop engaging with the Sri Lankan military and the Sri Lankan security forces as a whole. The second issue that I want to mention today is sanctions. sanctions on individuals. There are a number of governments, countries now that have human rights sanctions regimes. These are sanctions that are targeted. They're placed specifically on an individual who is credibly accused of human rights violations. So they don't have an impact on the wider population within that state. They are very, very targeted to that individual. The UK has recently put such a scheme into law, as has the EU. Canada also has a sanction scheme, and the US. There are also other states that have these, so I'd encourage you, if you're based elsewhere, to see if your state has such a regime. So far, we've not seen many Sri Lankans being targeted under these sanctions regimes. We'd like to see the UK, Canada, the EU, and the US sanctioning at least 2 individuals, Shavendra Silva, the army commander, and Kamal Gunaratne, who is the current Secretary of Defense, who were both major commanders on the ground in the final stages of the war. They are very obvious targets, and they have key positions in the current government. So those designations would have a major impact. Those are 2 really obvious things that states can be doing and can be looking at. As well as generally changing their relationship with Sri Lanka to show that this is not a normal state they are dealing with anymore. We need to move to a situation where there is much more awareness about the violations that are happening in Sri Lanka and the way in which the government is becoming, as I mentioned, authoritarian, militarized, and lacking any respect for human rights and rule of law. I think the change of heart by Police Scotland has shown that people power really does work. These campaigns do have an impact, and it's really important that we all keep going. And I would ask you to help us raise awareness of what's going on in Sri Lanka, and also to lobby your governments to take at least the steps that I've mentioned today. So thanks again to Marianne for organising this and inviting me to speak, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And I think that that last point about people power working is one that I hope everybody takes away with them today, because I spent the morning in a meeting about non-violence and how do we achieve non-violence. And I think that what we have done is use a non-violent method to seek change in a very violent country, and I hope that we can continue to work in that way. We've got a little bit of time, and so I'm going to, what I will do is ask Melissa to list those actions that she mentioned, and I'll put those on the website. We can work on that. This recording, use it as you will. Once it goes up, we'll have links on our website there too. One of the questions that we have for Father Nandana is, what Father Nandana, are you with us? I can, aha, there you are. What can we do to support your work? This is coming from Anne, who says she's going to write up what she's learnt today and send it to her parliamentary representative. What else can we do?
Yeah, actually, well, there are many things, because victims, we are providing protection and security to victims of torture, rape, and many other victims who are suffering with many other violences. So actually now our major problem is providing protection and security. So sometimes we have to send them to different places at different times. When we feel that they are vulnerable, then we have to shift them. So that is also a kind of a major work where we have to engage, and also we have to provide them because these torture victims, actually some of them we have been accompanying them for a very long time, because the case delay, court delay in Sri Lanka is a major problem. So it takes sometimes about 5 years and 10 years, about 10 years, even more than that. So therefore, we also have to provide support to the families, and also sometimes to the education of children, etc. That way, if you can help us, that also might be very helpful.
So again, we can share information about contacting on our website. There is a question here that I'm afraid I don't think that I can help with directly. It's from Telina, and it says that she's doing a mapping of stakeholders working on prevention of violence against women and girls for the UK government-funded programme called What Works? Impact at Scale, and would like to have contact details of anyone who gives consent. If participants have concerns of sharing contact details, like it if the organisers of the webinar can share their details. Now, because of data protection, I couldn't possibly do that, but if anyone wants to send a direct message to that posting on chat, but make it very clear, please do that directly there, not to everyone, then that's the only way that I could see that we can do that, because data protection and certainly what we've heard today is something that you know, sharing contacts is not something that we can possibly go into. There's a comment. There are many thanks to all of our speakers, obviously, but there's one which says thanks to Francis for bringing the focus to focus the suffering of the women in Sri Lanka. She couldn't bear to hear of the atrocities quoted, committed under the government mandated to protect its citizens. I think we probably all felt that way from all of our speakers. The pictures that we saw from Father Nandana certainly were very shocking. And this person says it's hard to believe that anyone can stand up against the regime. But I think that what we've heard today is hope that we can, in fact, make differences. And I think that that people power that Melissa spoke of is something that is very important. You're all here today because you had an interest in this. Please use your voices for the voiceless that we've heard about so much. A quick question here. Well, it's not a quick question, but I'm just looking at time. This is Carmen in Uruguay, who says gratitude and admiration for the work of the speakers. Her question is wanting to listen to the final remarks of Father Nandana, since she thinks there were more proposals. So were you thinking, Carmen, that the rest of Father Nandana's PowerPoint was something that we should have access to?
Yes, because he was about to finalize his speech, and I watched something like a legal reform or something like that, but he did not finish. So I would like to listen from him what was his final remark. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I speak? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes. Actually, what we are, we are doing court monitoring along with all our cases, and because we think that there is a lot of injustice within the justice system, because justice there is a problem with the present justice system, and we want reforms in the justice system, as well as we campaign to have reforms in the police, which we have been campaigning for many years. But unfortunately, it has become worse because now we don't have even the police commission. We have all those last 5 years, we had Human Rights Commission, police commissions, and all those things, independent commissions. But we have commissions now, but which are not independent. And also, I mean, I also wanted to say something about the women who are. I mean, we are working with several we call women-headed families, because the husbands or the family members are disappeared. So those families are called women-headed families, especially we have in the south, and also very much in the in the north, in Jaffna and also Mena. We are trying to have programs with them for healing and reconciliation. So with regard to my suggestions were, especially we look forward, and we hope that someday we will have reforms in the judiciary and in the police.
Thank you very much for that. And one thing that Carmen adds to that is, which is the big power supporting the government? Who is behind all of this? Does anyone have any? Robert, do you have a comment?
Well, Sri Lanka is because only country that does not care about human rights is China. I mean, China has no ethics, no principles. They will support any government which has no human rights, will not, they don't mind. So we are now totally dependent on China. So that's why the government is, they think they do not need any help from the West. So because China is already always willing to help Sri Lanka, and they don't care anything about human rights standards or human rights principles. They don't care. So this is a big problem for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Make a quick comment on that. I mean, I think that is true that China does play quite an important role in propping up the Sri Lankan government. But that being said, like we haven't talked about this during this presentation, but the economic situation in Sri Lanka right now is pretty dire. Like it constantly feels like the government is like a check away from falling apart. And that actually means that there is quite a lot of leverage held by other actors. So as much as China does offer loans to Sri Lanka, they come with significant conditions. That fact hasn't been lost, particularly in the South. And so countries like, or unions like the European Union, who provide a trade preference agreement to Sri Lanka via its GSP Plus scheme, actually have significant leverage. And for some reason still haven't actually even moved to the very first step of enhanced engagement to suggest that Sri Lanka's human rights situation is pretty horrific and they aren't complying with the several international conventions that they are meant to under the GSP Plus scheme. So I think there is quite a lot of potential for actors like the EU to really put to Sri Lanka all of the concerns that we've raised and others raised about the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, and make abundantly clear that, you know, if they don't comply or if they don't make progress, then they can't receive this trade preference that they desperately need to hold up their economy. And the UK is currently in the process of creating a similar scheme because the UK has obviously left the EU now, and so is coming up with its own scheme, which from everything we know seems like it's probably going to be a watered down version of the EU scheme, which is not great. But this is the right time to really, like, if you're writing to your MPs or even if you're writing to MSPs in the EU context, like this is the right time to sort of make the point that Sri Lanka is a country that shouldn't be receiving these trade preference agreements because of its human rights record and its unwillingness to engage in international human rights bodies. And that needs to be made clear to them. So I think there is, like, yes, China is important, but there is a lot of potential in other actors that provide economic kind of support to Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I think you're correct, because there's a lot of still discussion going on about GSP Plus, and recently also there was a meeting, and there was a lot of opposition with regard to giving GSP Plus to Sri Lanka. One time it was not being given again during the last regime. It was given back, but now again they are seriously, I think, thinking of whether to allow it or continue or not. So I think, as you said, it is still be a very good campaign. When it comes to the European Union partners.
Thank you. And I realize that we could go on for quite some time, but we have indeed come to the end of this session. So what I'd like to do now is to thank Francis, Darsha, Father Nandana, and Melissa, and all of you who have joined us. I know that some of you have had to come and go. It's an awkward time for some people, but the recording will be available on our website, and I'll send out details to anyone who registered with us for today. But I would want to go with some words from Father John Convery, if I could hand over to you, Father John.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you for everybody who participated today. And a big thanks for the dialogue and for those who have given of their time to share with us for some very difficult stories for us to hear, but nevertheless necessary if we wish to work for justice and peace. So I'd just like to leave us with the prayer for the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, remembering today in a very special way all those people trafficked across the world, and especially in memory of those who died yesterday in that tragic incident off our own coast. A stark reminder of how we are interconnected and we live in a global village, and the death and suffering of any brother and sister is a slight on all of us. And so we remember in a special way those people, those families affected by trafficking, and those who lost their lives yesterday. Loving God, we lift all victims of abuse to you. We ask you to give them your love and protection. We ask for your courage and strength so we can speak up against the violence inflicted upon our precious people. Help us to see situations where violence is taking place and give us wisdom to know how to act. Merciful God, we lift every girl and young woman to you who has suffered or witnessed violence. We pray for justice in each of these situations and provision for a safe place where they can find healing. And may our God bless us, keep us, protect us, and give us courage in our work for justice and peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all. Please follow us on our website and social media, and take good care of yourselves and your loved ones. Go in peace. Thank you.
Thank you.